We're going to kick it off. So welcome everyone to the White Too Long Author Forum. I am very pleased today to have with me Bryan Kaylor and Beau Underwood. They are the authors of this brand new book out just in May. I still have my pre-publication version of it here. That's nice and big. Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. So it was out just in early May, so we're just a couple of months out from launch. But thanks to both of you for being here with us. I'll give you just a quick introduction, and then we will jump in. So Bryan Kaylor is a Baptist pastor with a Ph.D. in political communication. He serves as President and Editor-in-Chief of Word&Way, which is a Christian publication founded in 1896 and now available on Substack into the 21st century. Beau Underwood is senior minister at Allisonville Christian Church. It's a Disciples of Christ Church in Indianapolis, Indiana, and a senior editor with Word&Way. He is also pursuing a doctorate in public affairs. And we are very, very happy to have the two of you with us to talk here about your brand new book. Before we jump into the book, though, I thought I'd just give you a chance to talk about this. Is the first time we've had a co-authored book on the Author Forum, and maybe give the two of you a chance to just tell us a little bit about how your paths crossed, what led you to write this book. I know you've done other kinds of collaborations before, but maybe just tell us a little bit about what brought you together and to launch this book project.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Robbie. We really appreciate the chance to engage this audience and share this conversation together. So Bryan and I have both spent our careers in ministry and academia and in journalism at the sort of intersection of religion and public life. We actually met on social media. So at the time I was out in Washington, D.C., working for Sojourners, and Bryan was teaching at a university in Virginia. And then Bryan had moved back to the state capital of Missouri, which, if you all remember from sixth grade, is Jefferson City. And he was editing Word&Way there, or actually would come to edit Word&Way there. And I had moved back there to take a church. And we turned our online relationship into an offline regular lunch on every Monday, where we'd get together and solve all the world's problems. And I ended up deciding to go back to pursue the doctorate. And Bryan sort of said to me, let's co-write together and do some work together at Word&Way. And at that time, Substack was just beginning to launch. And so we launched our Substack, A Public Witness. And we've been writing together ever since. But this book really came about because we've been following the conversation about Christian nationalism. We've been writing about it. We've been reading all the great work by Andrew Whitehead and Diana Butler Bass and so many. But what we kept saying is, a huge part of this current problem, a huge sort of, tributary of this contemporary expression of Christian nationalism is all this mainline Protestant stuff from way back. And nobody was making that connection. And so we said, surely somebody's going to jump in and name this. And finally, we just decided to do it ourselves. So January of 2023, we wrote a piece for Religion and Politics that was kind of an overview or a summary of the argument we make in the book. And we got such a good response from that we talked to a publisher and ended up turning into the book you see before you today. So Baptizing America, we think, is a key piece of this conversation because it tells that story of how mainline Protestants helped make the soil fertile in which today's expression of Christian nationalism are really growing.
Great. And Bryan, may want to tell us a little bit about Word&Way, 1896.
Yeah, no. Which I can't imagine back then when they were putting together the newspaper and, I have some of the extra letters, in my office of, carving out the letters, and they're putting out each page, and I do it all on the computer. And we still have a print publication after 128 years next week. And so almost happy birthday to us. And I'm the 9th editor in that time period. So we've been blessed with some really long tenures throughout our time and some really interesting history. One of the things is, we do a lot of history in this book, and that's one of the things I enjoy is going back and looking at, well, what were we saying about issues as they were happening? And, how does that relate today? So when the pandemic hit, for instance, I went through our archives because our publication had already survived a pandemic before with the 1920 flu pandemic. And we were encouraging people to mask and to stay home and not go to church, which didn't mean Zoom church. It meant just stay home with your family. And so, I guess there's nothing new under the sun, but it's also interesting to see that we have survived some of these issues before.
Yeah. Yeah, and the three of us have crossed paths a number of times. So I think the last time we were all in person was in Missouri, right?
Yeah, you came out to Columbia, Missouri. Yeah.
Yeah, so came out, did a gig, and we went out to dinner, and then I used to teach at Missouri State down the road from where you all are, and then Beau, you're at Chautauqua right now, right?
I am. I just missed you by a week. You were here the week before. So
Yeah,
yeah, we've been
here last
soaking
week,
up,
last Friday.
yeah, the Chautauqua experience this week.
Well, great. Well, let's jump in. So here we are. It's July 2nd, right? We're 2 days away from, if there ever is a conflation of God and country and Christianity and America, it's Independence Day, July 4th. So we're 48 hours away from that, and not even actually, we're at the end of July 2nd. So we're going to see all kinds of stuff. I thought I would start actually, though, with a memory of my own and get you all to kind of react to it. So I grew up, as many of you know, in Southern Baptist in Southwest Jackson, Mississippi. And I wrote about this just recently at White Too Long, about this memory I have of a couple of times, actually more than once, but a 4th of July service where we actually had a military color guard march in the Christian flag and the American flag into the sanctuary, like from the back, to sort of some music, kind of marching down the aisle. And they would sort of went down, it was the Baptist church. So at the front, down below the pulpit was the communion table. And so, right in front of the "Do This in Remembrance of Me" table, they would kind of part ways. They went up the carpeted steps and deposited these two flags on either side of the podium, kind of flanking the pulpit. Right. And I don't actually remember which flag was in which position. I know you guys talk about that and the implications of that. So you can say something, but I remember vividly, and that wasn't new for July 4th. It was a kind of standard every Sunday. Both of those flags were on and in Vacation Bible School. I remember, speaking of those flags, we would go into the sanctuary and we'd have those little chords. They would play an up chord for you to stand up and a other chord to sit down. But you would say the Pledge of Allegiance in the church sanctuary as kids, not just to the United States flag, but to the Christian flag. That was this, and it had, its own. And by the way, we would also add a Pledge of Allegiance to the Bible to that, and that triad in Vacation Bible School. So anyway, like, how common is that? In your, and I know you look at this across the board, and not just in evangelical circles, but in mainline circles. I'll just kind of kick it off there.
Yeah, so I'm an older millennial, and I had that same experience growing up in my Disciples of Christ church in rural Illinois, where every year at Vacation Bible School, every day we said those same three pledges: to the American flag, the Christian flag, and to the Bible. One of the things we ask in
For
this
the record,
book,
the disciples are not evangelical, right?
correct, yeah, no, we're the mainliners, right?
Okay.
This was a common occurrence. And so one of the things we talk about in the book is using the flag as an example of the way, obviously, as a symbol of how these identities have been conflated and fused. So asking churches to have this conversation about, how did that flag get in the sanctuary? What does it mean? What's going on there with it up front and center? One of my colleagues once referred to sanctuaries as an embassy of heaven. And so if it's an embassy of heaven, like when I lived in DC and you walk by the Australian embassy, they flew the Australian flag. It would have been strange to have seen the American flag flying at the Australian embassy. So if our sanctuaries are embassies of heaven, why is a symbol of any nation in that sacred space? If God is truly, for Christians, the God of all the nations, it seems kind of strange to make our worship of God a partisan affair. And yet there's a backstory to that. And I'll let Bryan jump in here, but it's a backstory that really puts the mainline church front and center.
Yeah, and I think it's not just a mainline story, but it's also a story of war. And so I think your experience with connecting it with the color guard, right, is really important. We see that flags come into church sanctuaries usually in times of war. There's going to be some exceptions, but if your church has a flag in the sanctuary and you are able to find the records when it came in, it probably came in for a lot of German-speaking congregation or communities. It came in during World War I, but for most congregations, it came in during World War II. And so it's, Christian nationalism, we find, is inspired by war and also then inspires war. And so this is a cyclical cycle there that's going together. And the order really matters. I mean, I know you said, Robbie, that you weren't sure exactly where they were placed, because we do talk about that. But I do suspect that you all probably followed the U.S. flag code, because that's what we find in both evangelical and mainline, churches, that when you do multiple pledges, the U.S. flag comes in first, and you say that pledge first. And if they're on stage in the sanctuary, then the American flag is to the right of the pulpit of the preacher, and the Christian flag is to the left. Or if it's outside on the flagpole, the American flag is either higher, or even if they're on the same pole, is literally above the Christian flag. And all of this is, we're following the U.S. flag code to put the American flag in the place of superior prominence. And what we're saying is that this one trumps the other. This one is where we give our first allegiance. I mean, this is, starts to get into some dangerous theology. I mean, Jesus taught us that we cannot serve two masters. And it's not just that we're doing a two kingdoms trying to serve two masters. It's that we're saying, with the way that we display our flags, with the order that we say the pledges to them, we're saying, no, actually, this one's first and the other one is second. And that's pretty dangerous when we start thinking about that, how that contradicts the very theology we claim to be coming and gathering together there in the church. And so, but it's common. I mean, we can look at a church like First Baptist Dallas, or I wrote our Substack this week, a public witness, about First Baptist Church Atlanta and their service just on Sunday with 20 American flags on sanctuary on the stage, and fireworks going off during the service, and military color guard, the full yard. But as we know in the book, we have a couple examples of prominent, progressive, mainline churches that are doing the 4th of July stuff also. And so it might be a little bit more subdued. It might not be quite as extravagant, and some of that's probably budget reasons. But we find this same God and country mixing, especially around the 4th of July, in mainline churches, just like we do in evangelical congregations.
Yeah. Well, I will stay on the flag for just a minute. I want to get to some bigger picture things, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the Christian flag. It was one, and I think you're right. If I'm kind of remembering now, I do think it was left of the pastor. Now that in my mind, that seems right to where it would have been. But I know a lot of people are not familiar with that flag. And the place where I saw it most recently and most prominently was on January 6th. Right. And so amid a sea of other flags, I mean, there were certainly American flags. There were Trump flags. There were Confederate flags, but there was also the Christian flag flying, not in opposition to any of those things, but right alongside and in the same spirit of those flags. And there's even video like from the Select Committee on January 6th of the Christian flag entering the breached, Capitol and kind of being marched through. But maybe say a little bit more about like, what is that flag, where did it come from, and how does that connect up to this bigger narrative?
Yeah, and the history of the Christian flag is itself very much wrapped up in kind of patriotism and probably even early signs of some Christian nationalism. I mean, it's red, white, and blue. It's modeled after the American flag, and that's not by coincidence. It actually comes from 1897, and it comes out of the mainline tradition and an early Sunday school in New York, and the guest speaker hadn't shown up. And so then the superintendent is giving a spontaneous message and looks over and sees the American flag in the sanctuary and is inspired using, I guess, the American flag as the text, if you will. And it's like, hey, what would it look like if we had a Christian flag? And so then you can see then how the flag the Christian flag is designed. It borrows very heavily from the American flag colors and the basic design. The pledge comes a little bit later, and it's designed after the structure of the U.S. pledge. And when the U.S. pledge changes a little bit, the Christian flag changes to continue to that modeling that sequence there. And so it is very much coming from a Christian tradition, or from an American tradition. And then one of the things that we note in the book, though, is we're also seeing the Christian flag being co-opted in a lot of ways, not just on January 6th. We've actually been seeing this for several years prior to January 6th as a kind of a supplement, even a stand-in for the Confederate flag. And we trace a number of occasions when, the Confederate flag was, too controversial. And so the organizations that are, that want the Confederate flag will either put a Christian flag with it, or take the Confederate flag down and put the Christian flag in as the stand-in. And so we can see this co-opting of the symbol I mean, symbols change meaning over time. And so we're not huge fans of the kind of overly American design of the Christian flag, and it feels a little crusader-ishy to start with. But I think it's particularly losing its value as a symbol because it's being used by white supremacists and other hate groups as, you know, their symbol. And so we're concerned about that as well.
Yeah, just to describe it to folks, it's basically a mostly white flag with a blue canton square up in the corner and a red Latin cross there. But most of the field is white and then kind of blue and then red Latin cross.
Basically, you erase the red stripes, you erase the white stars and put a red cross in there. And that's it.
That's right. Yeah. So that's kind of what it echoes. So, you know, it was notable in the book. Let's just do a couple of terms real quick before we get too far down the pike. So the title is, or the subtitle is, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. Now, for those who aren't all that steeped in the kind of crazy, complex world of Protestant denominations and denominational families, there's basically two, right, big families, the white evangelical side, and then what have come to be called the mainline side. But maybe you could just say a little bit more about that mainline term and how you understand that and use that in the book, just so we're all clear before we get too far down the road.
Absolutely. You know, part of our critique has been that, you know, evangelicals have been getting all the attention in our public life and a lot of the blame for Christian nationalism. And we think mainliners, given the size that they have in our society, you know, they're still about a third of American Christianity. They deserve equal attention in terms of from the media, and they deserve some of the blame for this Christian nationalism as well. So again, I feel a little weird talking to you, Robbie, about who counts as a mainline Protestant because you know this better than I do. But as PRI's data shows, you know, they're still a powerful force, and traditionally they've been classified by belonging to the seven sisters of the mainline. I won't go through them all, but it's your UCCs, your Episcopalians, your Methodists, Disciples, American Baptists, etc. And then now it's expanded, you know, to include a bunch of other denominations that kind of align with them theologically, etc. So your Cooperative Baptists, a bunch of others. But we also follow the work in the book of David Hollinger, who talks about mainline Protestants as being this group that is also much more ecumenically minded. So they're willing to cross denominational borders in terms of their common social witness and mission. And also those who are maybe a little bit, certainly are more inclined to bring in the modernist values in terms of including science, including historical critical understanding of the Bible. But there's a lot of different, a certain kind of ethos that defines mainline Protestantism vis-a-vis American Catholicism, vis-a-vis American evangelicalism. So it's one of those categories that gets really ambiguous at the boundary, but generally if you belong to one of those denominations and have that mindset of you're more ecumenical in spirit and you're more accepting of sort of modernism, you're probably a mainline Protestant.
And one other thing I'd add too is about power, right? Of the mainline that I think it was actually David Hollinger, I'll credit him here too, who said, kind of summed it up as like, look, if you were in charge of something big and powerful and important in the government or in the corporate world, chances were pretty good you were connected to the white mainline Protestant world, right? And it's just, you know, even that term white Anglo-Saxon Protestant WASP is essentially describing that the power of that kind of mainline Protestant world.
Especially at the time period that we focus on in the book, right? I mean, you know, we see in our history, we see waves of Christian nationalism, and we're definitely in a wave right now. And the current wave is much more of the white evangelical wave. But the late 40s, throughout the 50s, early 60s, that wave of Christian nationalism is when mainline Protestants are in charge. And so, you know, the politicians are mainline Protestants predominantly, the prominent clergy in society, and so forth.
And just notice we got David Hollinger in the house. We'll come back to you, David. So, thanks for that. He's got already a question in the chat. Yeah, we'll actually maybe we'll let you answer it when we get to there. Well, tell us a little bit about, so you know, part of what you're describing here is a almost like a prehistory of the current incarnation, right, of Christian nationalism that we're seeing in the country today. So if you kind of sketch that out for us as you do in the book, like what are the waypoints or like to say it like, you can tell me whether you agree with this or not, but I was joking with you before we got on, you know, part of the arguments maybe like, you know, that civil religion that the Mainline embraced, in the last sort of 100 and 150 years was kind of like the gateway drug to kind of hard Christian nationalism that we have today. But if you kind of sketch that out for what are the waypoints that really stand out to you that you kind of highlighted in the book as maybe key turning points or things that have kind of really changed the direction that we're still like living with today?
Yeah, so I mean, the key time period. I mean, we have a few other moments that we hit in the book, but that key point is that era right after World War II, the start of the Cold War, and this is when there's really is this kind of almost religious revival in the American government. It's when we see in quick succession the creation of the National Prayer Breakfast. We see under God put in the Pledge of Allegiance, in God we trust. It becomes the national motto. All of this stuff is happening in quick succession. And then there's also some things that are happening on the religious side as well, with the founding of the National Council of Churches and some developments in kind of pushing some what we would call Christian nationalism. And a lot of this stuff has historically been called civil religion as a way of kind of differentiating it from what we're seeing today. That civil religion is good and Christian nationalism is bad. And we argue that the distinction isn't as stark there, and perhaps there isn't even a distinction as well. That at best what we're looking at is a softer, friendlier, cuddlier version. It's not quite a storm the Capitol version of Christian nationalism, but we shouldn't let it off the hook. And I do think that the example of Under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, which we just passed the 70th anniversary of, I think that that's probably the clearest example to show us what's happening here. It was on Flag Day, June 14th, 1954, that Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the legislation putting Under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. And it all happened because of one sermon, which, I mean, Beau and I both note that we're pretty jealous of. That to imagine, a sermon being remembered, past a week is pretty exciting, let alone having such a massive impact on United States society. But a Presbyterian USA pastor and a very progressive pastor at that. He marches later of MLK. He has King preach at his pulpit. He preaches himself against the Vietnam War when the Secretary of Defense is in the congregation. I mean, we're talking about a very progressive individual who also wanted us to be a progressive Christian nation. And so the whole point of this sermon, because he knew Dwight D. Eisenhower was going to be sitting there in February of 1954 on the Sunday closest to Lincoln's birthday, the whole point of the sermon was, we need to put Under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Like, that was the point. And he defines in the sermon, America is a nation that was founded on the Ten Commandments and the words of Jesus of Nazareth. Right? He's making this Christian nation type history argument that we would hear today from like a speaker Mike Johnson or a pseudo historian like David Barton. And then what's really stunning after he makes this whole case for why we need to mark the nation as under God is he says the quiet part out loud and says that, yeah, there's some people that can't say that. They can't actually pledge allegiance under God because they don't believe in God. And he says, but an atheistic American really is a contradiction in terms. That's what he says in his sermon. And then goes on to call them spiritual parasites. And this is the sermon that convinces Congress and Eisenhower to put Under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. So, I mean, that is Christian nationalism. To define someone as not American, not fully American because of their religious beliefs. At the time, he's only excommunicating civically a couple of percent. We still find that problematic. But today, I mean, as you know, with the rise of the nuns and as well as the rise of atheists and agnostics beyond that, right? That's a much larger percentage of Americans that are being defined as not really American. And so civil religion worked to some extent in the 50s because it really was a unifying country. If you talk about God language and generic religion terms, it did bring us together. Civil religion doesn't work in a pluralistic society. It looks like Christian nationalism. And again, as we were saying, it really wasn't all that, safe and unifying at the time because it was deliberately marking some people as not real Americans. And we find that to be pretty problematic.
Yeah, if I could just add two things here. Back to that sermon Bryan's talking about, one of the other things he says is, if the atheistic American denies a Christian ethic, he falls short of the American ideal of life, right? Now, that is Christian nationalism, right? It's our definition today. If you fuse these identities together so that everybody who doesn't fit it is less, that's Christian nationalism to a T. And if we're going to call it that today in 2024, then we need to be honest about when it was preached in 1954. We may have had a different label back then, but it's still the same cultural framework that's operative in both instances. And this also proves a little bit of our argument of the book, which is I talk about how the mainline Protestants sort of made the soil fertile in which today's expression of Christian nationalism is growing, because when David Barton and other evangelical speakers and pseudo-historians talk about why America is a Christian nation, right? When they say we are that today, they say we've got under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. They say in God we trust as our national motto. They tell all these stories, and these are their data points. And a lot of those data points and stories are the result of the work of mainline Protestants. So that's why it's so important to connect these histories, because this explosion of Christian nationalism we're seeing now is really based upon so much of what mainline Protestants did 60 and 70 years ago.
Well, we're going to turn to questions from the floor here. So let me just go ahead and say we got a couple in the webinar chat. Feel free to go ahead and put some questions in there. We're going to turn to those in just a minute. But I was going to go to the practical questions. So, you know, what's a mainline Protestant to do?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the crux of the book, right? We know that this can seem overwhelming. It can seem like it's such a big problem. What can little old us do about it where we're at? And the answer is first, think about those spheres where you have influence. I've got bad news for everybody listening. Posting a rant on social media about how bad the evangelicals are is not going to change the world. The church up the street that's lighting off fireworks on the 4th of July would never let me preach in their pulpit. So I need to think about where are those places and spaces where I have some influence. And oftentimes that's my congregation, my denomination, those like you, Robbie, who invite us to speak. And so we're naming, like, we have to do some of this work ourselves. We have to look at our own traditions, interrogate our own stories, and practice some good old repentance. Let's confess where we went wrong. Let's commit to doing better in the future. And then let's live out our convictions on this issue. Let's stop making it all about them, and let's start doing some work on us. And we think that can happen by, again, looking at your congregation's history. It can be talking about your flag in the sanctuary, or the liturgical words you use on Memorial Day, or, you know, other hymns you might sing on other patriotic holidays. Look at yourself. And if we can cut out some of the Christian nationalism in our own churches, we create a different witness than First Baptist Dallas and what they do on the 4th of July. A witness that we think is a lot more compelling to people who are looking for something other than Christian nationalism when they're looking for a church home. So start where you have some influence and do the work there rather than just ranting about it on Facebook.
Yeah, and then I mean, I think, you know, as both we note these steps at the end of the book, and I think, you know, knowing that history is important, confessing that history in your own faith tradition, in your own church, and just how can we move the ball a little bit? I mean, it's important to recognize. I mean, we cite the work of sociologists like Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry. We also cite the work of PRI on this. That Christian nationalism is a continuum, right? It's not that you're either a Christian nationalist or you're not. And so, I mean, you have a scale that you ask people, you know, and then based on that, some people are off the charts. I mean, they hit every single item. They're full-fledged on pushing and promoting Christian nationalism. But in some ways, all of us have a little bit of Christian nationalism in us. If we grew up in a white Christian church, whether it was an evangelical, a white Catholic, a white mainline, if you grew up in a white Christian church in the United States, it's in the air we breathe. It's like microplastics. There's a little bit in all of us. And so we're still all trying to detox. Like, I mean, we confess in the book, we have pastored and been in context where looking back, we're like, oh, like we weren't, not only were we not confronting it, perhaps we were even helping aid it, or at least, you know, comfort it along a bit. And so I think it's important to recognize it as a continuum, because it would be easy to look at the people who stormed the Capitol and say, you know, to borrow from a parable of Jesus, you know, thank God I'm not like one of them. Like, I thank God I'm not like that, you know, insurrectionist, and ignore our own ways that we can reduce Christian nationalism and our own theology, our own mindset, that we can, you know, separate what's American and what's gospel, and how can we, you know the difference between those. And so we all can move on that continuum away from the full-fledged Christian nationalism.
And I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but I will say there's more and more progressive Christian organizations, mainline Protestant denominations, that are issuing statements, speaking out, passing resolutions, all good stuff. But so many of them are castigating the other and not doing this work within themselves. And so even at the institutional level, this is work that needs to be done, just like we've done in other issues, right? A lot of our denominations have looked at their role in racism and enslavement and other things that have really been incredibly negative parts of their history, and they've made confessions and they've committed to doing better. We can do the same thing here with Christian nationalism. It just takes that level of work and commitment.
Yeah, just to put a couple of numbers on it before we go to questions. When we did, so here at PRI, we've done a couple of very large surveys, and two of the largest surveys ever been conducted to measure this. And we do measure it with an index of 5 questions. I'll put a link in the chat to the data if anyone wants to look at it. But it is true, right, that white evangelicals are by far the most susceptible, I think, to kind of being drawn in and supporting. So we find, for example, that's about 2/3 of white evangelicals that are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers, right, on that spectrum. So kind of either leaning toward it or full on agreeing with every question we ask on this. And the mainline are in a different place, but it's still true that 1 in 3 of the white mainline Protestants, the kind of non-evangelical end of white Protestantism, and about the same number, about 1 in 3 white Catholics. So the other 2 kind of white Christian denominational families are also kind of either at least sympathetic to this idea of Christian nationalism. And as you say, it's been in the water, been in the DNA from the beginning. I mean, I've said, in the Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, I described it as, it's the version of Christianity that lands on the shores, right? Before we had a nation, we actually had the idea of this place being a kind of promised land for European Christians, right? That then gets attached to the nation that gets formed. But that idea was actually here before the Republic was here, right? And then kind of lives into that political expression. And as you say, I mean, there's completely incompatible, right, with the idea of a pluralistic you can't both be a Christian nation and a pluralistic democracy, right? But we've kept both of those traditions alive, right, all the way up into the present. So I so appreciate the work you all have done. Particularly, I always love and appreciate work that tries to sort of look at yourself, right? To kind of hold up a mirror, take a hard look, don't flinch, hold the gaze. What do you see? And then being able to apply the same metric, right, to across the board. So I really appreciate the integrity that you all have shown in the book that way. So let me, I'm going to go to questions here. So if you want to throw them in the webinar chat there. So the first one is from Linda about the flag. Is it a flag denoting Christendom rather than a Christian church? And I guess what's at stake in that distinction?
So I think I still remember the pledge, right? If I'm remembering this correctly, it's I pledge allegiance to the Christian flag and to the Savior for whose kingdom it stands, one brotherhood uniting all Christians in service and in love. And I think if you just listen to the words of that pledge, right, the word kingdom, brotherhood, it certainly does have that connotations of Christendom. So I think that's the right way to think about it. This was never a flag that was adopted by denominations and like, this is who we stand for, but it really does symbolize Christian power in our society. And I think it's all there.
In Southern Baptist life I grew up in, we said all true Christians. So, we weren't sure that we were accepting all of them. So that even put a more finer point on it.
Yeah, true Christians, right? Yeah.
That's right.
Basically everybody not Baptist.
You and I both came from that. We're both detoxing.
Right. All right. So David Hollinger, thanks for being on. Asks, Christian nationalism is now much more common among evangelicals than among mainliners who long participated in and decisively enabled it, as you rightly show. But why did Christian nationalism decline among mainline Protestants who remained after the exodus of the nuns? And does that help us better challenge Christian nationalism among evangelicals if we think about that? That's a really great, complex question. So I will throw it to you guys.
So I'm going to offer a tepid answer to the first part. I'm going to let Bryan, the harder part, on figure out what this means for evangelical. David's work has been so informative to me in understanding the history of mainline Protestants. If you all haven't read Christianity's American Fate, go do it. Read our book first and then read his, and it's just fantastic. But I do wonder if it's actually lessened, right? So I'd have to go back and look at the data, but I do think we've seen, I'm thinking back to Under God, that's the mainline Protestants also scored pretty high on the Christian national spectrum. I do suspect there was a little softer, a less militant Christian nationalism, because they were, especially from the age cohorts, they were raised in this era where church and state just went together so well and so easy, and there wasn't seen as this conflict. What was good for God was good for country, and vice versa. And it's only now that we're in this moment and we're living through these sort of polarized, intense periods in our nation's history that we're starting to see that there's more of a conflict than perhaps we care to realize. So I still suspect there's a lot more soft Christian nationalism in our mainline churches and people may want to think about, and that's going to make people more uncomfortable. Part of our hope of our book is we unsettle this a little bit so people can have a real conversation about it in the mainline context. Now, what that tells us about evangelicals, I know Bryan has a really brilliant answer on.
Well, so I mean, I would say that I mean the problem, we don't have the great data. What we don't have is, we don't have PRI data that was testing people in 1954. So what we don't know for sure is how much less on a Christian nationalism scale are mainline Protestants, than they were back then. I mean, I do think that one of the reasons it's still there, Dinah Butler Bass calls it the establishment hangover, right? And this nostalgia that some in the mainline tradition have for that time. Oh, you remember back when life was simpler and we were influential, right? Those were the good old days. And that nostalgia is a nostalgia for a time of when mainline Protestants were running Christian nationalism. But I would say that if it has declined, and I think it probably has some, despite the hangover, some of us perhaps have detoxed or had enough coffee to get over it. I think there's a couple of factors. I mean, I think that and this is one of the things that actually David Hollinger traces in his book is really important between mainline Protestants and evangelicals, is the on race, right? And so one reason why the white evangelical church is growing is because some people are leaving because of the embrace of the civil rights movement, and that naturally cuts against Christian nationalism. I mean, we really are talking about a white Christian nationalism, which makes sense. I mean, as you documented in your most recent book, I mean, if we were founded as a Christian nation, it was only for white Christians, founded on the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of Black Africans. I mean, that's only a nation for white Christians. And so our Christian nationalism in the United States is inherently racist. And the sociological research shows this. And so I think an embrace of the civil rights movement would naturally help undo some of that Christian nationalism. And then I also think being out of power could also help you rethink your theology. I mean, great theology is done from the margins and outside the realms of power. And so as mainline Protestants have lost their power, not that, I mean, they still have a lot of influence, but not what they had in the 50s and 60s. Right? That does make you start to see things from a different perspective. And so I'm not sure if there's any other answer besides that. And that's unfortunately, is the tough work. How do we get white evangelicals to listen to Black evangelicals, not to mention Black mainliners, Black Catholics, and so forth, right? And Hispanic, and to hear from these different perspectives of, well, maybe this idea of a Christian nation isn't actually that great of an idea. And how do we get them to detox from power in their own theology when they have the Speaker of the House? I mean, it's hard to step away from that in your theology when you are in power. But I think, for their own souls, that's what they need.
There's a question here as well from Harley about whether Christian schools have been an accelerant of Christian nationalism, particularly, I guess, the rise of the kind of segregation academies in the wake of the desegregation and Brown v. Board of Education. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and then also the growth then what passes in the curriculum there. I mean, if you start looking at the curriculum, that's where you see, as textbooks, works by David Barton today, right? And so if you're in the homeschool network or you're in a private Christian school, you're getting a different version of of American history, and it is more Christian, right? So we were founded as a quote Christian nation, and you're getting taught things that don't match what's happening in the public school, and I would say don't match what actually happened either. And so it can be this bubble that's hard to get out of when you're taught this is the way the world is. And unless you have that like Truman Show moment where you're able to actually see there's something else out there and it was all just put on as a show for you, like it looks real, and it really is a problem.
All right, we got Candace has raised her hand. I'm not great at this, but Candace, if we're going to allow you to ask a question here. Well, I hope the technology works. So here we go. Have to unmute and let's see if it'll work. All right, if not, let's see.
There she goes.
Hey, Candace, go ahead with your question there.
I didn't really raise my hand. I didn't mean to.
Oh, all right. Well,
sorry.
here.
I didn't mean to, but
okay,
this is fascinating. So
we'll move on. All right. Well, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, let's see. The next one here is a question about again, what do we do? And we are in a moment where we're seeing things like Louisiana, right, passing this 10 Commandments law that's kind of, and it's notable, right? It's essentially a King James version, a Protestant Christian version of the 10 Commandments. Nobody's saying they should put the Jewish Publication Society version of the 10 Commandments or the Hebrew version of the 10 Commandments up displayed prominently on the wall.
Or the Catholic version in a state where Catholics are the dominant group.
Yeah, that's right, or a Catholic version. And then we got Tulsa declaring that, every teacher should have a Bible in a public classroom and teach from it in the public classroom. So we're seeing these kind of pushback of things that we thought were, kind of settled. And we have case law already on the 10 Commandments, but here we are, again. So, what do we do? I think, how do we counteract it is essentially the question.
Well, I think before we talk about what we do, I think we need to talk about what's going on here, because we're all outraged by it, but I think we need to reflect on a couple of things. The first is that this is really an attempt to use state power to coerce religion, right? And so that's been obviously something that we thought the Supreme Court has ruled unconstitutional. We would hope that it would do so again. But it also smacks of desperation, right? It smacks of a group of people who think that they're losing something, right? There's this fear of loss, the sense of a country that's becoming more secular, less Christian, certainly more pluralistic in its belief, less white in its composition. And so I see a lot of these things as essentially last gasps of this sort of certain power structure that Christian nationalism is designed to uphold, right? Part of what Christian nationalism is an attempt to privilege a certain group of people to maintain a retrograde social order. And I think Louisiana and Oklahoma, no pun intended, are textbooks examples of this. So I think that's we need to realize what's going on there. Some of this is demographics, right? The country is changing. What I lament as a pastor is that this is also making the work of churches harder, because there's so many people that are seeing this and they're going, if what it means to be a Christian is what they're doing in the state legislature or Donald Trump holding up the God Bless the USA Bible, I don't want any part of that. And so ironically, these people who think that they're protecting Christianity are really doing the church a grave disservice by bringing church and states together in this way again.
Yeah, I agree. I think these last gasps you show the people see what we might call, I don't know, the end of white Christian America, right, on the horizon. So it's a good phrase. But no, I mean, also I think the Louisiana example I think is particularly important, as you were noting that there's different versions of what even are the 10 Commandments, and that to me shows one of the key problems of Christian nationalism is that it's not just that we're going to have this generically Christian nation; it's that it's only ever just a sliver of Christianity that's getting privileged and that gets the power. Right now it's white conservative evangelical Christianity. In the 50s, it was mainline Protestant version of Christianity. Russia is a great example of this. Russia is a Christian nationalist state. You have the Russian Orthodox Church has extra privileges, extra economic possibilities. They have extra influence on legislation. And yet it doesn't mean it's good for Christians if you're outside the Russian Orthodox Church. The most persecuted group are Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, but the second most persecuted group in Russia are Baptists, and the third are Pentecostals. Right? So they're the quote, wrong kind of Christians. And I'm talking about hundreds of Baptists and Pentecostals are being arrested and fined and even jailed every single year since the 2017 anti-evangelism and anti-missionary law. And so Christian nationalism isn't only a threat to those who aren't Christians, it's also a threat to those who aren't the quote right type of Christian, that aren't the Christian in power. And so we see that with Louisiana as well as Oklahoma.
And I don't want to lose the question. So what do we do from a Christian perspective? It's you create alternative Christian communities that are compelling because they don't promote Christian nationalism. from a democracy perspective, you do all we can to remind people that what democracy required is everybody deserving equal respect, equal voice, and Christian nationalism is inherently contradictory of that. And as we're seeing with these laws, it makes quite clear that certain people are being excluded by the nature of their religious belief from our public schools. And that's something we can't stand for because it violates the core of who we are as a nation.
Well, just because I can't resist it, I'm going to give a few numbers here on the end of white Christian America, because it is notable. I think you're right that there is a kind of death rattle or kind of desperation that I think is animating much of this. And I actually think even the whole MAGA movement and the kind of embrace of the unembraceable, here is a kind of move of desperation. Now, that makes it dangerous, I think, because it has thrown out the normal rules, the normal principles that might serve as guardrails, because the ends are so important that the means cease to matter, right? In this kind of emergency, apocalyptic kind of worldview. But the numbers are pretty clear in terms of kind of white Christianity. Again, back in 2008, Barack Obama was running for office. The country's 54% white and Christian. If you take all Christians together, all white, non-Hispanic, Catholic, Protestant, non-denominational, 54%. That number today is 42%. And even if you just look at white evangelicals, and this is kind of notable, in the last 20 years, the group that's lost the most in our members as a percentage are not the mainline. It's the white evangelical group in the last 20 years. The kind of second wave of white Christian decline has been steeper among white evangelicals. They've gone from being essentially a quarter of the country at the turn of the 21st century to 13.7% of the country today. And so I think it's that slide. And I think in particular, even if they don't know the numbers, the Southern Baptists, the denomination I grew up in, for example, they've lost 3 million members from their height. 3 million, like in a single denomination, in that same period. So that's kind of a big deal. And I think the bigger thing is that they're aging. The average age is going up. It's now 56, the median age among white evangelicals. And I think, what that means is that as they're shrinking, the median age is ticking up, they're losing young people. And so what's clear, though, I think, is people do know, like my daughter, my grandson, they're not in the fold right anymore. And that, I think, is very personal and set off a lot of these alarm bells, and is kind of this trying to claw back, right, what has the sense of being lost here. Anyway, so thank you for letting me go my little monologue. There's a great question here about the white Catholic Church. I know that's not the subject of the book, but it's an interesting question from Teresa. Does any data exist to suggest that the white Catholic Church is affected on this Christian nationalism spectrum by its status as a global church? Like, does that, I guess, mitigate this sense that, it's all about America?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think. I think the Catholic Church has had a couple of things that has helped mitigate against Christian nationalism, and that is one of them, right? That be inherently reminded of the globalness of your faith. One of the things that Christian nationalism does is it wants us to focus on those within our border first and foremost. Again, a lot of this is wrapped up in war, right? So that way we're ready to march to war to kill the people on the other side of that human-made border, even if they might be Christians. Right? I mean, national sovereignty needs us to rally around the flag. Christian nationalism is very helpful in that regard. We've seen that particularly with, the Orthodox tradition. The Orthodox Church has been very susceptible to Christian nationalism, not just in Russia, but elsewhere, because of defining itself so much with these national borders. But the Pope, right? The Pope kind of is always the symbol of the leader of your faith is not in the United States, unlike, the mainline denominations that, for the most part, the ones that we all have been a part of, the evangelical and mainline, the leader of the denomination is always in America, right? And so that's one thing that helps. I think the other thing that helps the Catholic Church in some regards, as long as you don't lose the memory of this, is that minority status. Right? So Catholic Americans have been persecuted. Again, like this whole idea that Christian nationalism also persecutes Christians. Now, sometimes you lose sight of that. Southern Baptists, lost sight of that. Some Baptists, I count myself as one of those, still recognize that We have this long history of Baptists being persecuted in Christian colonies at the start of our, nation, that Christian nationalism was targeting our people. And that's why it's so important to keep church and state separate. So, I think in some pockets of Catholicism, there's still this reminder that Christian nationalism is dangerous because our grandparents or our great-grandparents were persecuted because they weren't the, quote, right kind of Christian. But when you grow in numbers or you have a chance for some political power, sometimes you also lose that memory.
Yeah, it's notable. I've been thinking with this King James version of the Ten Commandments, I've been thinking a lot about the King James Bible has a long history of being weaponized against Catholics, right? Being forcibly read in public schools, where people were like openly saying, we think if we read the King James version of the Bible in public schools, it will loosen the bonds of Catholicism on the next generation of Catholics, right? And like an overt kind of de-Catholicization policy, right? Weaponizing the King James. So whenever I see the King James version of anything being thrust into public view, it's actually not so much about religion as it is marking territory, right? It's almost like a totemistic use, right, of the Bible to kind of just say, nope, this is ours and not yours. And I think that's what you all have been saying. Like whenever you see that this is ours, you're not the right kind of Christian, you're not the right kind of American. We know that like Christian nationalism is like they're like raising its head. So the
Robert,
question,
can I just add to that though? In one of those moments where if you don't, laugh, you're going to cry. When former President Trump came out and endorsed the God Bless the USA Bible with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and all that, I laughed when I realized it was the King James version of the Bible, right? That it was, here's this, how can you God bless the USA with the King James version? Then that story, I mean, we put this hypothetical in the book because the book came out before Trump did that of, could you imagine Trump endorsing a book from the Oval Office with Paul Wright and some others? And then, of course, it happens. But the reason we called attention to it was a parallel thing had happened in 1952 with Harry Truman, where the first version, the very first copy off the printing press of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible was presented to Harry Truman in the White House Rose Garden, and then he gave a speech by the National Council of Churches, by progressive Christian leaders, and Truman gives a speech basically conflating the biblical message and his foreign policy goals. Again, it's Christian nationalism. That makes the question, why do we care what version of the Bible the president reads, right? Why should we as Christians want the endorsement of the president or any political leader for our sacred text? I've never had somebody answer that question for me well. And it continues to be very prevalent in our conversation right now as Trump did that.
Well, one more here from Dick is a question about coming in waves and like what seems to set it off. Why does it kind of come and then kind of subside? And we said a little bit about why it's back now, but like, why does it seem like we've got it settled and then it sort of like comes roaring back?
I mean, I think that's a great question. There's probably a number of factors, and we've talked about demographic shifts. I also just wonder if we just, we don't remember our history. Like we learn a lesson and then we forget it as a people is part of the problem. I mean, I think about, Beau just gave the example of the first RSV Bible given to Harry Truman. The guy who led the translation committee and is in the picture handing Truman the Bible is mainline Protestant minister. He was the dean, had been the dean at Yale Divinity School. He also, Luther Weigel, he also is an expert witness in the Bible case that goes to the Supreme Court, the Abington Township case. But he's an expert witness for why we should have the Bible in public schools. Again, I mean, there's, liberal mainline Protestant Christian nationalists. And I actually just a couple months ago was in DC and met the namesake of the case. Ellery Shrimp was the young boy that his father sued on behalf of, right? And so here was this Yale Divinity professor was the one on the other side saying he should have to hear the Bible and should have to say the Lord's Prayer in public school. And Ellery made a comment about like, we thought we had all of these things settled, and he's lived long enough to see that it's all getting unsettled again. I think it's just that we don't remember what we learned. I mean, I think about this with the Southern Baptists, the tradition that I grew up in, but I'm no longer a part of, is that they lost the lessons of history. I mean, the King James Bible, I mean, the guy who writes the first English defense of true religious liberty for all people is one of the first two Baptist pastors, Thomas Helways in Amsterdam, is writing this, and he says all people should have religious, not just my people, but all people. He sends a copy to the King of England, who is King James, and it comes out within the same year that the King James Bible comes out, and this great Bible guy, King James, puts Helways in prison where Helways dies for the sin of believing, the crime of believing that all people should have religious freedom. Right? We've completely forgotten that lesson, that it's better for the state and it's better for the church when they're separate. And so I think that's why we see these waves, is that we just don't remember the lessons that we've already learned, and we get drawn into the temptation, the siren song of power and empire once again.
Yeah, well, I'll say one quick note on that, and then I'm going to turn to you guys for a last word here. So I'll get you to think about that. The one thing I will say about that is that, yeah, I think power is right. That and I think we've often wanted to play it both ways. I'm just more and more convinced of this, that we wanted to sort of pay lip service to saying we support a pluralistic democracy, we support those principles of freedom, of equality. We want to say that. But we have at the same time want to claim this other vision, right? Of nope, but this is also a chosen kind of a promised land for us. And we're up here and everybody else is just a little bit lower, or maybe a lot lower, depending on who they are. And we've just never really fully exorcised, I think, that second vision of things. And so it sticks around, right? It may kind of go a little dormant or whatever, but then it's fully available, right, to rear its head when there feels like some threat there. So why don't I turn it over to you guys for each maybe like a last word, and we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much for the book. Let me just hold it up again here before I give you the last word. It's Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. Bryan Kaylor, Beau Underwood.
You can buy the smaller version.
Yeah.
So our publisher would want me to name that if you buy it at chalicepress.com and use the code BA for Baptizing America, BA podcast, you'll get a third off the cover price. So you win and they win. And it's just been such a joy to do this work with Bryan. Wish it wasn't on such a difficult subject. But I do think that we're quite humble about sort of dipping our toe into these waters. But this is such an important piece of this overall conversation in terms of the mainline Protestants' role in all of this. And so I hope that folks will find the book an interesting contribution to that larger conversation, because I don't think you can fully grasp what's happening with Christian nationalism right now unless you understand the mainline Protestant component of it. And we hope that you all find that interesting.
Yeah, I'd say, Robbie, again, thanks so much for having us. This has been a really delightful conversation, and all of you who have joined us. We do also have a study guide that you can download for free if you're interested in using this in like a small group at a church or somewhere else. And we have it at our Substack, publicwitness.wordandway.org. So if you go to publicwitness.wordandway.org, on the top tab, you'll see something called Baptizing America. And it's a PDF, and you can download a study guide. It has, I think, 3 or 4 questions per chapter as a way of just kind of helping use this in a small group setting. And if you're using this in a church Sunday school or something, send us an email. I also have our emails on that website. And, we'd be happy to come in, one of us or both of us, and Zoom in for a session if you're doing that in your church somewhere. So.
Great. And again, that's Chalice Press, right? And the code is one more time.
BA podcast.
Great. Well, Bryan, Beau, thanks so much. It's a fantastic book. It's got a really original angle on this, and I think, as you said, kind of fills in, so much of the backstory. And I think there was several like, oh right, moments for me. For me, and I've thought a lot about this, but I think there's like, oh right, yeah. Now the dots are connecting more thoroughly. So thank you all for doing all of that work. And for the book, it's out. You can get it directly from Chalice Press and from everywhere that's selling books. So thank you all for being with us tonight and for joining us for the White Too Long Author Forum. Have a good evening.
Thanks.